If you could find your seats quickly, we'll be able to start. Please also take a moment to turn off your cell phones, please. And I'd like to call your attention to the fact that there will be a reception afterwards, so you can spend time with our speaker. And there are also his books available, and if you want to get a signed copy, that's one of your options. We are not always happy. Sometimes a state of mind can become tyrannical and ragingly powerful, other times oppressive and debilitating. Our special guest this evening, Andew Solomon, is an author who has spent a fair amount of time in less comfortable cognitive landscapes. And the harrowing narratives of his experience have helped millions of readers feel new heights of empathy and have deepened our understanding of what it is to be human. Tonight he will be discussing the creative mind, melancholy, and pain. Professor Richard Gordon will introduce our special guest in a moment. I'm here to say a bit about creativity and mind at Bard, and to acknowledge and thank the many individuals who are responsible for bringing our guest to Bard, especially the family of Jamie Bernard. The James Kirk Bernard Foundation was established to support scientific research on depression and autism. It is through their support that we are able to consider together why creativity and self-expression are sometimes impelled by our less comfortable emotions. Bard distinguishes itself as an intellectually rigorous liberal arts environment that attracts and inspires students who are fascinated by the literary and creative arts and who share a sense of connectedness through social action, challenging all aspects of the human condition from multiple perspectives. There are many examples such of these opportunities at Bard, from the Language and Thinking Program, Citizen Science, the Bard High School Early College Programs, the Hannah Arendt Center, the Trustee Leader Scholars Program, and student groups such as Active Minds, whose mission it is to improve understanding and acceptance of individuals who experience a vivid range of emotions, including depression. In Bard classrooms, we learn the role of mirror neurons in empathy. We learn about the genetic factors that influence autism. We learn about neurotransmitters that suffuse the brain in moments of elation and insight. And we learn the intrinsic rewards of creation, resolution, and closure. The full range of life at Bard complements a science approach so that we can appreciate the implications of these findings, examine how we make decisions, how we view and respond to each other, and the type of communities that we decide to build. Our students ask not only what do I know and how do I know it, but more importantly, our students have the desire and the encouragement at Bard to pursue the more important question, what am I going to do about it? Programs like the Mind, Brain, and Behavior Concentration provide an interdisciplinary haven for students who want to learn more about the neuroscience of cognition, imagination, and creativity, and who want to combine what they learn in the sciences with their passion for the arts and language to develop a deeper understanding of what it is to be human. Andew Solomon, like Jamie Bernard, is a gift to all who have the bittersweet experience of reading his accounts. His narrative experience inspires empathy, compassion, and respect. We're able to share his presentation tonight thanks to the support of the Wellness Committee, the Bard Dean of Students Office, and Active Minds. Most importantly, we extend our thanks to the James Kirk Bernard Foundation for their ongoing support of Active Minds and for bringing Andew Solomon to campus to help us all continue to celebrate a life of immense creativity. Here to introduce our speaker this evening is Professor Richard Gordon.
For your patience with two introductions. One of the remarkable historical trends in the field of psychiatry and its cognate helping professions in the late 20th century and the early part of the 21st is the recognition of the crucial importance of depression in terms of its widespread but often hidden prevalence, its cruel consequences for psychic life and physical well-being, Indeed, the World Health Organization, in a massive study conducted in the 1990s, concluded that depression would be the #1 cause of disability in the world by the year 2020, a year that does not seem so far away at this moment. One wonders at this widespread awareness of the importance of depression as an illness. One thinks about the preoccupations of late 19th century psychiatry with phenomena such as hysteria and the relatively minor attention given to depression. One phenomenon we know was very important in our growing awareness of depression was the discovery of antidepressant medications in the late 1950s, although their importance was hardly noticed at first. However, this was a crucial discovery. Depression was now an illness that could be treated at a medical level. Perhaps it was not yet noticed because the pathology of depression was still not recognized for what it is. It was not until the less toxic antidepressants, such as Prozac, entered the scene in the late 1980s that this could occur. But I remember even my own clinical internship in the early 1970s in New York City that depression was beginning to be taken seriously, and it was suddenly registering with psychiatric observers that depression was the central problem for many patients whose diagnoses were currently being misconstrued. Andew Solomon's book represents a kind of apogee of the awareness about depression that has occurred. It is both a reflection of a historical trend, but also a marvelous, wide-ranging guide to the many dimensions, personal, scientific, therapeutic, social, and political, of this insidious and devastating illness. While Andew Solomon begins his treatise with a deep exploration of the sources and subtleties of his agonizingly painful journey, he then explores in depth and develops an elaboration of such problems as the relationship of depression to addiction, the understandable and yet sometimes desperate search for alternative treatments, the roots of depression and evolution, the larger social dimensions of depression, and the psychic devastation that poverty wreaks on the human soul. Solomon's voice remains alive throughout the book, and he often reflects on the relationship between either his own interviewees or other authors' experience on his own struggles. This transforms what might otherwise be viewed as a textbook, at least an outline, into something quite different. We welcome Andew Solomon's amplification and reflections on the subject of melancholy and creativity. Light has been thrown on his work on a buried and still taboo source of human misery. Andew Solomon, we're grateful that you are speaking us tonight at Bard College.
Well, good evening. Thanks to all of you for having me here and to the many organizations that have apparently helped to make it possible for me to come. I'm delighted to be here, and I said recently I gave a talk at my own alma mater and was talking about how when I was an undergraduate I had always dreamed when I walked through the place where we had to then go to get our books that one day I would be the kind of author who people were required to read in college. Little expecting it would be a memoir and that it would be read in the abnormal psych class. But I nonetheless made it through. I'm very interested in this question of depression, the creative mind. I'm interested in larger questions of depression as well. There are kind of two false assumptions out there, I think, one of which is that only creative people actually know these terrible demons, and that's not the case. I've met many people who are very depressed and who are not remotely creative. But I think I think that's a misapprehension. But on the other hand, there's also, I think, a misapprehension that somehow one doesn't have a right to depression if one isn't experiencing a kind of isolated and devastated life, and if one has no internal capacities at all. I think that's also a fiction. And just to give you a little bit of background, I've been working for the last 11 years on a book which will be out in November, which is about how families respond to various kinds of challenging and unusual offspring. Families of deaf people, families of autistic people, families of people with schizophrenia, families of musical prodigies who are also quite overwhelmed, and so on and so forth. And as I've done that work and have been very much immersed in the world of all of these families, various people had said to me, but you did that depression book, don't you want to do more on depression? I said, no, I think I've covered depression, but I was wrong. I hadn't covered it. It comes up over and over and over again. It comes up in conjunction with those other conditions. It comes up in conjunction with the process of trying to make sense of the world that lies at the root, I think, of all creative writing. And I was very struck by a conversation that I had fairly recently with a well-known author who preferred that I not use her name to protect the privacy of her brother. But she's been an enormously successful author, and her brother has schizophrenia. And we were talking about the experience and about what it meant for her and what it meant for her family and about all of the things that they'd grappled with. And toward the end of our conversation, she said to me, you know, my brother has the same mind that I have. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, I also make up whole worlds and try to describe them in ways that are convincing and try to live in them as if they were reality. She said, but I know they aren't real and I write them down. So I've won a lot of literary prizes and he can't make that distinction. And so he'll spend the rest of his life in mental hospitals. And I think the fineness of that line is incredibly vital. I also think that there is a sense in which almost all mental illnesses are useful in small quantities. So to have a little bit of the kind of slightly crazy imagination that the person I've just described had has been very useful for her, and to have a lot of it has destroyed her brother. To be a little bit obsessive is a necessity if you write books with lots of footnotes. To be too obsessive can actually destroy you. And I think it's true with depression too, and I think it's part of what makes it so difficult to reconcile depression and creativity and to figure out how to balance them, that there's actually great meaning in sadness, and the sense of disaffection can be a motive for reaching out across that disaffection, connecting with others, or it can be the basis for looking deep into yourself and finding what's new and original in your own experience that you can express. And so I think this sense that depression can be at the center of great creativity or can be the obstruction that prevents someone from achieving creativity has to do with how much depression there is, how well it's regulated, what the personality of the person is. And we don't have a sort of depressionometer in which we can say, you know, if you have 4 degrees of depression, it's very useful, and if you have 8 degrees, you're in real trouble. We have this very variable set of symptoms that manifest in randomly complicated ways. A lot of our medical culture is binary because decisions about whom to medicate and how to treat people are binary decisions. You have insurance coverage for therapy or you don't. You need the medication or you don't. You're going into the hospital or you're not. But the reality is that the human experience consists almost entirely of nuance and shades of gray. And so often that binary model, which has become prevalent for pragmatic reasons, causes people either to think, well, I don't really have depression and therefore not to deal with the complexities of their moods, or to think, I have depression, therefore I'm someone who's terribly ill and I have to sort of just cave into it because there's nothing that I can do about it. They're both dangerous models. The book that I wrote about depression was a book that I spent some considerable time working on. I had been depressed myself, very severely depressed, and then as I began to emerge from that depression through a mix of treatment and medication and therapy and time and some changes in life circumstances, as I began to emerge from it, I tried to write down some of what I had been experiencing because that was a means of processing it. Much of what I wrote down by way of processing it would not be very interesting for anyone to read, but there were moments in it that I thought might be. And then I wanted to read everything I could on the topic. And what I found was that there were extraordinary personal memoirs in which people courageously talked about their struggles. And there were medical textbooks which explained a lot of what we understand, which is still quite primitive, about the neurology behind the condition. And there were sort of sociological texts that tried to talk about what was happening, and there were economic treatises that talked about what the consequences of depression were. World Health Organization, as mentioned in the introduction, was very involved in figuring out what the economics were of depression as a persistent illness. And all of these books were very interesting, and they all used different vocabulary, and there didn't seem to be anything that brought them all together and that reconciled them. And so part of what I wanted to do in writing a book was to write something in which I attempted to address the idea that actually people talk about the biochemical explanation of depression and the psychosocial explanation of depression, and those are two different vocabularies for a single set of phenomena. And when our capacity at brain imaging is much more advanced, we'll doubtless be able to see all kinds of subtleties and complexities that we can't now see. And it will always be the case that those subtleties and complexities will affect our behavior and our experience. And this business of saying, well, I have a depression, but it's really biological, or I have a depression, but it came out of these experiences. It all is related to one's experiences. One's experiences are inextricable from one's biology. And so I felt like there was a need somehow to pull that together and to say that in the same way that a word can exist as a sound or as a set of shapes on a page, and both things are describing some other phenomenon, so these are different ways of describing a single experience. And of course, as soon as you say that, you realize that depression also refers to a set of experiences which are different for everyone who grapples with them. But I also got very frustrated as I worked on this material by the idea of depression as a modern Western middle-class illness, which is a very pervasive idea out there. And I really wanted to write something in which I indicated that it is, in fact, something that has existed across history and was described 2,500 years ago in much the terms we use today, that it's something that exists across cultures. I went off to look at depression among the Greenlandic Inuit and depression among survivors of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and at tribal rituals for the treatment of depression in Senegal. And also then to look at the idea that it exists across a wide spectrum of the of financial situations and social situations, that in some ways the people who are more privileged are more likely to seek treatment, but the complaint itself does not select only for those who are privileged, and does not, in fact, even manifest most frequently in people because of some self-indulgent navel-gazing that is apparently the affliction of people who are more educated and who have more prerogatives in life. So having looked at those three problems, I then began to filter them through the experiences of other people. And there are lots of people in the book that I wrote, and I'm going to describe just a few of them to you, who are all people who are in fact extremely creative, and to talk about their experiences of depression as well as my own. So my sort of first really serious depression began in 1994. And my mother had died in 1991. I had been very, very traumatized by it. I wrote a previous book, which was partly about those experiences. And as long as I was writing it, I somehow remained in those experiences. But I wouldn't say that the depression was really, in any simple equivalence, a result of my mother's dying. It was more that my mother's dying opened up more widely a sort of abyss of despair that I think had always been there. And in retrospect, I was talking to some people earlier today about the counseling services here at Bard. When I was an undergraduate, I think treatment for mental illness was still very stigmatized. I know it's still somewhat stigmatized, even on liberal campuses. I had a lot of precursor depressive episodes, and I managed to keep functioning through them, and I wish that I had recognized them for what they were and that I had gotten the treatment a long time ago. But in any event, in 1994, I really began to go to pieces. And I was in treatment then with someone whom I fondly refer to as the incompetent psychoanalyst, and who kept telling me that she thought it was very courageous of me to keep fighting this depression without medication. And so I kept fighting it, and I kept getting worse and worse and worse. And finally, there was a day when I woke up, was the day, I think, before my 31st birthday, and I was lying in bed, and I had been feeling so anxious. I had been finding everything so overwhelming, and I had been doing less and less as a result of that. I would come home and I would hear the messages that people had left for me, and instead of thinking how great all those people called, I would think, How will I ever call them back? And I would get up and I would think, I really should take a shower, but the idea of going in and turning the water on and having to stand underneath it and then take the towel off the towel rack, and then it just all sounded like the Stations of the Cross more and more. And so I found myself withdrawing from life. And I finally reached the point on this day before my 31st birthday when I woke up and I felt so paralyzed that I almost wondered, in fact, I did wonder whether I might have had a stroke, because I was lying in bed, there was a telephone on the bedside table, and I kept thinking, I feel so bad, I have to call someone for help. And I lay there for 4 hours staring at the telephone and not able to bring myself to reach out and pick up the telephone. And I think that there's often confusion about what the essence of depression is. Depression is often accompanied by sadness, and it's a very sad state, and there's a lot of sadness that's part of it. But I think depression, most of all, is the loss of vitality. It's the loss of the energy to be engaged in your own life. That's a sorrowful condition, and it may be triggered by tragic events in one's actual life. But the feeling that one has in depression is not so much of sadness, but of nullity. It's a kind of feeling of disappearing. And on that day, I lay in bed for 4 hours, and finally the phone rang. And it was my father. And I said to him, I don't know what's happened to me, but I can't move. And he said, well, wait right there, and I'll be down. And a relationship I'd been in a little while before that had ended. I was feeling alone in the world, even though I had friends and so on around me. And it was humiliating to move back into my father's apartment and to be so overwhelmed that I couldn't even manage to cut up my food. And he would joke and say, I'll be an old man someday and you'll cut up my food. And I said I would. And he is old now, but he's still cutting up his food quite admirably. But in any event, it was just a terribly difficult time. And one of the things which is actually one of the symptoms of the illness is that when you're in it, you tend to see medical professionals who brightly say to you, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to treat it, you're going to get better. Really, it's not going to last very long. But the feeling you have is that it will last forever. And I know there's been an issue of suicide on the campus here, and I'll return to that a little later in the talk. But I think that the reason, or part of the reason people tend towards suicide is that there is that sense that no matter what everyone else is saying, it won't get better. And what you're experiencing is somehow the new reality, which will be the reality forever. And it's intolerable. It's intolerably painful. I'm going to read to you just a little bit from what a couple of the people I interviewed had to say about their experience of depression. This is from a writer named Laura Anderson, who wrote to me after I'd written something journalistic about depression, and we then got into a long correspondence that became quite central to this book, and she remains a great friend. And she wrote to me in September of 1998, which was fairly early in our knowing each other. And she said, I am not yet in a full-blown depression, but I'm slowing down a little. I mean that I have to focus on each thing I do on more and more levels. I'm not completely depressed at this point, but I have entered a recession. And then she said a week later, I only take baths now because the water beating down on me from the shower is too much to deal with in the morning and seems these days like such a violent way to begin the day. Driving seems like such an effort. So does visiting the ATM, shopping, you name it. And a week later, the whole day thus far has been an exercise in forcing myself to do the tiniest things and trying to evaluate how serious my situation is. Am I really depressed? Am I just lazy? Is this anxiety from too much coffee or from too much antidepressant? The self-assessment process itself made me start to weep. I looked at old photos today, and they seem like they are snapshots of someone else's life. And finally, she described going to the botanical garden. Her boyfriend dragged her out. It was the first time she'd gone out in quite some time. And she said, by the description of one tree, it said, all parts deadly poisonous. I thought maybe I could find the tree, chew on a leaf or two, and curl up under a rock ledge and drift off. I miss the Laura who would have loved to put on her bathing suit and lie in the sun today and look at the blue, blue sky. She has been plucked out of me. Depression takes away whatever I like about myself, which is not so much in the first place. Feeling hopeless and full of despair is just a slower way of being dead. I try to work through these large blocks of horror in the meantime. I can see why they call it mean. And this is from someone else who is a very old friend who I've known since high school. We were in college together, and she's an immensely brilliant and creative woman who's now published a book of poetry and is working as a psychoanalyst. But when we were in college, she developed bipolar disorder, and she had a terrible depression. It was the first time that I ever saw such a thing up close. And I remember at the time, people now say to me, oh, I deal with these people all the time, and they just don't understand. And I think I didn't understand either. I kept thinking, okay, I'm sorry you feel so bad, but, let's do something. Why don't we just open the window, come on. And there was always that kind of cheering her on thing, which I now really regret. I think it was incredibly counterproductive and rather annoying, I'm sure. But she then really did very well for a long time, and then she was seeing a psychiatrist who said, well, you've done so well for a while, why don't we see whether if you go off your medication, you'll be fine? This is usually not a good idea, and it's particularly not a good idea for bipolar illness, which is particularly unamenable to resolving over time. And she went into a psychotic manic episode, which was then followed by the worst depression I'd ever seen, in which she basically sat catatonic and didn't speak for, I would say, 2 months at least. And when we talked about it afterwards, this is part of what she said about it. This is Maggie Robbins is the name of this woman. I would lie in bed singing, "Where have all the flowers gone?" over and over to occupy my mind. I realize now that I could have had some other drugs, or that I could have asked someone to come and sleep in my room, but I was just too sick to think of that. I couldn't say what scared me so much, but I thought I would explode from the anxiety. I just went down and down and down and down. We kept changing medications, and I just kept going further down. I believed my doctors. I always accepted that I would eventually come back to normal, but I couldn't wait. I couldn't even do the next minute. I was singing to blot out the things my mind said, which were, you don't even deserve to live. You are worthless. You are never going to be anything. You are nobody. And that was when I really started thinking about killing myself. You don't think in depression that you've put on a gray veil and are seeing the world through the haze of a gray mood. You think that the veil has been taken away, the veil of happiness, and that now you're seeing truly. You try to pin the truth down and take it apart, and you think that truth is a fixed thing. But the truth is alive, and it runs around. You can exorcise the demons of schizophrenics who perceive that there's something foreign inside of them. But it's much harder with depressed people because we believe we are seeing the truth. But the truth lies. And I want to think for a second about that idea of a truth that lies, because I think it's a very potent idea and quite a wonderful description of part of what happens in depression. In point of fact, a lot of what she said is true, and a lot of the time, you deal with people who are depressed and they have two categories of statement that they make. Some things they say are untrue. People say, no one loves me, and you can say, lots of people love you, your wife loves you, your grandmother loves you, whoever it is who happens to love the person. Most people are loved by someone. But people also say things like, I just feel like whatever any of us do, we're all just going to die in the end. Or they say, each of us is in our own body. There's no real communion in which two people genuinely know each other. And what you have to say to that is, that's true, but we should maybe focus now on what we'll have for lunch today, and not on that. And what's curious in a way is the ability of most of us to tolerate so many of the painful truths of life and to go on with our lives without being profoundly undermined by those truths and by the kind of strangenesses that are embedded in them. And there was a fascinating study that was done a while ago in which a group of depressed and non-depressed people were given a video game to play. It was a very old video game. But at the end of the thing, they asked all of the people how many little monsters they thought they'd killed. I think people played for an hour. And the people who were depressed were mostly accurate to within 5%. And the people who were not depressed guessed between 10 and 15 times as many little monsters as they had actually killed. And one of the things that you have to struggle with in talking to people about depression is that frequently there is a lot of insight in depression. And that again comes back to this notion of depression in the creative mind. The reason that depression and creativity may be linked is in part because there is a lot of insight contained in depression. But some of that insight, no matter how profoundly true it is, can be deadly. And the protective coating of uninsightfulness that keeps most of us alive most of the time is actually a very valuable thing. And if one loses it, one is in serious trouble. So I'm going to talk a little bit about treatments and about the various kinds of treatments that people pursue. Often I found in conversation that people will say when they talk about their depression, they say in a very kind of brave way, well, I've just decided I'm not going to take medication and I'm going to fight this through on my own. And there are two problems embedded in that point of view, which for some people may be the correct one and may work well. One of them is that though it does not appear that most of the medications currently used, and certainly not the talk therapies that are certainly used, they don't appear to cause permanent damage to your brain. Who really knows? But they don't appear to. It is fairly clear that continued repeated depressive episodes do in fact carve paths into one's neural circuitry. That depression is a cyclical illness. Some people have a single episode occasioned by a particular event, but for most people who have recurrent depression, it will continue to recur. They will continue to have it. It will continue on an ongoing basis. And the other thing, though, is that people sort of say, well, I was depressed for a while, but I pulled out, and I might get depressed again, and I'll just make my way through it. And I always say to people like that life is actually very short, and one doesn't get the time back. If you spent the year that you were 27 being very depressed and didn't do any of the other things you might have done while you were 27, you'll never be 27 again, and that's it. And so a lot of the time that position, which seems stalwart and courageous, and which I think is intuitive, and which was the position I had in the days of the aforementioned psychoanalyst, it can be a very dangerous condition. That being said, I also think that there is a lot of evidence that that everyone has different things that work well for them, and what works for one person, what works for another person are different. And there are some people whose ego strength requires that they achieve resilience on their own, and there are some people who get terrible side effects from medications. It's a blur, and there isn't some universal thing. I'm frequently asked in public settings, I've been really depressed, what medications are you on? By people who assume that since I seem to be managing okay, that if they take the exact same things, they will. And it's again, the sort of sadness that it's so difficult to figure out. I'm on a mix of 5 medications. It took years to figure them out. They seem to work really well. It was a complicated process. The exact same combination will not work for most other people. And psychopharmacology and psychotherapy are both very subtle arts, which often gets lost. That being said, when I started working on this topic, I thought there are basically 2 things that are acceptable and that work. And one of them is psychotherapy, and the other is medication, and the rest of this stuff is gobbledygook of some kind. And then over time, I really shifted that point of view, because I came to think that, if you have lung cancer and you say, but I stand on my head every morning for 15 minutes and I feel great, then it's terrific, and it's wonderful that you are feeling better, but you nonetheless have lung cancer, and it will probably advance, and with no other treatment, it's likely to kill you. But if you have depression, and you say, I feel so much better if I stand on my head for 15 minutes every morning, then actually you found an effective therapy, because depression is an illness of how you feel. And if you feel much better after you do that, you're not depressed anymore, and it's worked. So I found people, as I was working on this book, who had practiced all kinds of things, some of which seemed zany to me, but that had worked for them. And I became very agnostic about it. I sort of thought, if you find something and it seems to work for you, who am I to question that belief? Some of them were a little bit extreme. There was one woman who wrote to me and said that she had tried medication, she had tried even electroconvulsive therapy, which is also very effective for depression. It's not the most pleasant treatment to have, but it is actually the most effective treatment that there is for depression. We don't really understand very much about the way it works. But in any event, this woman had tried all of these things, and she said the thing she had found that made her feel better, that she hoped I would tell more people about, was making little things from yarn. some of which she sent to me, and which I'm not wearing tonight. But in any event, she seemed to have a little element of obsessive-compulsive disorder as part of her complaint. But I'm now going to talk to you for a second about psychosurgery, and I'll talk about someone who's in my book, and I'll talk also briefly about someone who isn't in my book. The person who isn't in the book is someone called Helen Mayberg, who is a professor now at Emory, and who has really pioneered the use of deep brain stimulation for the treatment of depression. Deep brain stimulation is a procedure in which an electrode, it's been around for a long time in the use of working with Parkinson's disease, an electrode is implanted in the brain. It is used to stimulate a particular area of the brain, and so regularizes the metabolism of that area. And Helen was doing scanning work. She's really trained as a scanner, and she noticed that an area which had never really had any particular function assigned to it, called Area 25, seemed to be dysregulated in a lot of the depressed patients whose brains she was scanning. And so she came up with this procedure in which she actually implanted an electrode in this area, which had not previously been treated that way. It was a similar device to the one used for Parkinson's, but in a very different location. And she's achieved, especially in the last 5 years, the most astonishing results with what she's done. There's one of her patients who I talked to who described, and she described the moment when the device was implanted. She doesn't tell the patient has to be conscious through the procedure because you need to know if somehow something is going in the wrong place and they suddenly have a spasmodic response which might indicate a problem. But anyway, the patient is conscious and they get the device positioned and they turn it on, but she never tells the person that she's turning it on. And there was one of the patients who said, and the only people who do this are people who have failed medication, psychotherapy, electroconvulsive therapy, all other known and available treatments, and who are on permanent disability. So people who are really very severely disabled with their depression. And she said, she turned on the device in this one patient, and the patient said, "What did you just do?" And she said, "Why?" And he said, "All my life I've been in a room with 1,000 screaming children, and they just left the building." Most of us are not going to pursue invasive brain surgery. I mean, she gets huge numbers of letters from people who say, you know, my antidepressant's being really tired, so I thought maybe I'd get deep brain stimulation instead. She says, you really don't want people cutting your brain up unless you really, really have to, and drink more coffee. But the idea, anyway, of that intense physicality of depression and that sense that we're in a state of constantly of discovering a new approach, a new address, you know, my hope would be, and I think hers too, that perhaps there are other less invasive ways of targeting that area. Perhaps there are medications that can reach there. Perhaps there are even talk therapies that somehow will appear to change the way that metabolism goes forward in that Area 25. I'm going to describe to you someone who, when I met him, was unspeakably depressed. He was a guy who had he went to Northwestern. He was on the soccer team. He was a kind of all-around, well-adjusted, nice guy. And then one day, he was driving home from a movie theater, and he suddenly felt such a strong compulsion to kill himself that he almost couldn't make it home. And he turned the car around, and he just drove to a hospital and said, I don't know what's happened to me. Over the years that followed, he had reached the point at which he was having electroconvulsive therapy on a monthly basis because it was the only thing to which he was responsive. He would have the therapy at the beginning of the month. The aftermath of having ECT treatments is that you're usually quite zonked and out of it for a week or so. He would have a week of feeling okay, a week of going downhill, and then he would get to the point at which he was in such catastrophic condition that he had to go back for another round of treatment. And he said to me, he said, I have a plan for how to end it all, he said, because I can't keep going like this. And he had heard about a procedure which was a precursor to the work that Helen Mayberg has been doing, which was a cingulotomy that was practiced at a hospital in Boston at Mass General. And he wrote and asked whether he could enter the cingulotomy protocol. And I met him shortly before he went in to have the surgery. And one of the things that I remember being struck by, and this comes back to the idea I started with of the nuance of psychic experience, I thought, it's a lot of optimism after you've failed all these treatments and after you've had at that point 7 years of being basically completely disabled by this, even if you're saying that you have a plan for how to end your life, still the fact that you're going to go and try one more thing represents a certain underlying resilience. And it's one of the things that's been fascinating to me in working with people who are depressed, is that sometimes depression takes away all of that resilience. And sometimes it's there under the most puzzling and surprising of circumstances. I want to read to you from a letter he wrote me a year after the surgery. He said, "My dad gave me 2 presents this year. First, a motorized CD rack from the Sharper Image. It's totally unnecessary and extravagant, but my dad knew I'd get a kick out of it. I opened this huge box and saw something I didn't need at all. I knew my dad was celebrating the fact that I'm living on my own, have a job I seem to love, and can pay my own bills. The other present was a photo of my grandmother who committed suicide. As I opened the present, I began to cry. She was beautiful. She's in profile looking downward. My mom came over to the chair and asked if I was crying because of all the relatives I never knew. And I said, she had the same disease I have. I'm crying now as I write to you. It's not that I'm so sad. I just get overwhelmed. Maybe it's that I could have killed myself but didn't because those around me convinced me to keep going. And I had the surgery. I'm alive and grateful to my parents and the doctors. We live in the right time, even if it doesn't always seem like it." I found that very profound and very stirring. And as someone who is doing reasonably well on an intense medication regimen, I also have that sense that, well, there's a great deal about our times that I don't care for, that we're incredibly lucky in this regard. I hope that when in 25 years, people will say, how could you deal with those primitive medications and those awful treatments and so on, that there'll be this huge leap forward. But in looking at that experience of the different ways that people address this and the different qualities of resilience that people find, I became, as I mentioned at the beginning, very interested in cultural models of treating depression. And I traveled to Senegal because I wanted to look at a treatment which I'd heard of, but about which not an enormous amount had been written, called the Undop, which was used for depression. And I happened to have a good friend who was living in Senegal and who had a Senegalese girlfriend. And I said to David, do you think Hélène could possibly help if I wanted to research this? And he said, oh yeah, she definitely could. So I went to Senegal, and we went to see someone who Hélène actually knew, who was the cousin of a friend of the mother of someone she went to. There was some long, complicated line of connections. But it was someone who actually performed the Undop. And so we went off and I interviewed Madame Diouf, and she told me all about the procedure. And at the end, I said to her, I really would love to see an Undop. I said, do you think that would be possible? And she said, well, I've never had a foreigner. Tubob was the word in the local language. Witness one before. She said, but if you wanted to, then yes, you've come with Hélène, we have this connection, you would be welcome to. And I said, that's fantastic. I said, when are you next going to do one? And she said, well, definitely sometime in the next 6 months. And I said, that's a long time for me to be here waiting for the Undop to come along. And I said, is there any way to expedite this process? She said no. And so I said, well, thank you very much. And I said that I was going to go. And just as I was leaving, she said, I hope you don't mind my saying this. And I said, what is it? And she said, you don't look that great yourself. She said, are you depressed? And I said, well, I am still somewhat depressed. And she said, well, I've certainly never done this for a foreigner before. She said, but if you would like, I could do an Undop for you. And I said, oh, yes. I said, that's a great idea. Yes, absolutely, that would be great. And we left, and Hélène turned to me and she said, are you completely crazy? Do you have any idea what you're getting yourself into? I won't take you through the whole complicated tale of what it was all like, but I will tell you that the high point of the Undop came when I was put in a makeshift wedding bed in the central square of this town. And all of the residents of the town who had taken the day off to come and participate in this were dancing around me in concentric rings. I was in the makeshift wedding bed with a ram, and I was told that it would be very, very bad luck if the ram got away, so I was holding on to the ram, who was not very happy about the arrangement, and at some key moment, they were throwing pieces of cloth over us. They suddenly yanked all the cloth up. I was pulled onto my feet. The loincloth, which was all I was wearing at that point, was pulled off. The ram's throat was slit, and I was covered in the blood of the freshly slaughtered ram. And I thought, this is a change, I thought. But I had a very interesting experience a few years later while I was working on my current book, which was actually quite sobering, which is that I was in Rwanda working on other research entirely, and I was talking to someone when I was there, and I described this experience that I had had in Senegal. And he said, oh, it's very interesting to hear about that. It's really very different from anything that would happen here. That's West Africa, this is East Africa, it's a different... And we were talking about the whole structure of things, and he said, he said, we had a lot of problems here after 1994 with Western aid workers who came to Rwanda. He said, when we're trying to use techniques that were just wrong for us. And I said, really, what did they do? And he said, okay, he said, unlike the thing you've just described, they did not take people outside where the sunshine helps you to feel better. They did not get the whole village to join in acknowledging the problem. They did not describe it as something that was invasive as a spirit and could therefore be taken out of you. He said they did not have music to kind of get your blood up and going. He said instead, they took people one at a time into these dingy little rooms and asked them to talk for 45 minutes about bad things that had happened to them. He said, made everyone completely miserable. We had to put a stop to it. So that was that experience. But back again to my point of the subtlety and complexity of depression. I'm going to skip relatively quickly forward, but I wanted to just touch on the two other areas that I alluded to before I return to a couple of the people you've heard from already about their depression. Hippocrates, describing depression, said in 2500 BC, in 500 BC, 2,500 years ago, said that it was an illness associated with autumn, seasonal lecture series, associated with autumn, and that its symptoms included sadness, anxiety, moral dejection, tendency to suicide, aversion to food, despondency, sleeplessness, irritability, and restlessness, accompanied by prolonged fear. So that's really a description that seems to me to be every bit as good as the one that's in the current Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. And further, not only did he have that idea, but he also said that it was an organic dysfunction that should be treated with oral remedies, and he argued a lot with Socrates, who had said that it was a philosophical problem that was resolved by conversation. So that split between the medical people and the therapy, that goes back a lot longer than you think. They didn't, however, have the oral remedies, only the idea that what one needed were oral remedies. But I really want to talk a little bit about the issue of depression among the very poor. If we understand that depression is, in large measure, a dysfunction of the brain, and that it's likely to be triggered, at least some of the time, by traumatic circumstances, it doesn't really make much sense to think that people who are living incredibly bleak, difficult lives would be less vulnerable to it than others. And yet that idea is unbelievably persistent in the cultural discourse in this country and in many others. And what I realized as I worked on this is that if you have an absolutely fantastic life, but you feel really awful all the time, it's obvious that there's something wrong with you. And people will say, that's so crazy, you've got such a great life, why do you feel like that? You should see someone. If you have a terrible life and you feel terrible all the time, the likelihood is that the reason that you will think you feel terrible is because your life is so awful, and nobody will say that's so strange that you feel that way. But a lot of the time, people who are leading unbelievably difficult lives and feel very depressed are not depressed because of how hard their lives are, or at least not so much, as they are having very difficult lives, because when you're depressed, it's very difficult to fix any of what's wrong in your life, no matter what level of privilege or lack of privilege you may be at. And so the question of depression among disadvantaged populations in this country is an enormous problem, and it's a problem which has received shockingly little attention and to which there's very little address. There was a professor who I got to know who was doing research in this area in the Washington, D.C. area. She had set up a protocol in which she screened all of the people who came through a clinic looking for treatment for it was a family planning clinic, and there were people who were coming in for treatment, and she just did random screenings, and then she decided which of those people appeared to meet criteria for depression, and she offered them treatment. And some of the women were game, and a lot of the women actually had to kind of be talked into it. And so I met some of these women both before and after treatment, and I'm just going to describe one of them to you. This was someone who said to me, I had a job, but I had to quit because I just couldn't do it. I don't want to get out of bed. I just feel like there's no reason to do anything. I'm already small and I keep losing more and more weight. I don't get up to eat or anything. I just don't care. Sometimes I sit and just cry, cry, cry. Over nothing. Just cry. I just want to be by myself. I had nothing to say to my own kids. After they left the house, I would get in bed with the door locked. I feared when they came home 3 o'clock, and it just came so fast. My husband was telling me I was stupid, I was dumb, I was ugly. I'm tired. I'm just so tired. I've been taking painkillers. It can be Tylenol or anything for pain. A lot of it, though. Anything I can get to put me to sleep. And this woman was brought into a protocol in which she received 6 months of treatment. She was in group therapy, and she received some medication. When I saw her 6 months later, she had left the abusive husband. She had gotten a job. She was transformed to a degree that seemed almost inconceivable. And I should have mentioned before I began that she had 7 children, which would be overwhelming, I think, for almost anyone. But she was suddenly dealing with them in a completely different way. And this is what she had to say to me then. She said, my kids are so much happier. They want to do things all the time now. We took hours every day, and they are my best friends. As soon as I come in the door, I put my jacket down purse, and we just get out books and read, doing homework all together and everything. We joke around. We all talk about careers, and before they didn't even think careers. My eldest wants to go to the Air Force. One wants to be a firefighter, one a preacher, and one of the girls is going to be a lawyer. I talk to them about drugs, and they keep clean now. They don't cry like they used to, and they don't fight like they did. I let them know they can talk to me about anything. I don't care what it is. There's one room in the new place for the boys, and one for the girls, and one for me. But they all just like to get up on my bed with me, and we're all sitting around there at night. That's all I need now, is my kids. I never thought I would get this far. It feels good to be happy. I don't know how long it's going to last, but I sure hope it's forever, and things keep on changing. The way I dress, the way I look, the way I act, the way I feel. I'm not afraid anymore. I can walk out the door not being afraid. I don't think those bad feelings are coming back. And if it weren't for Dr. Miranda and that, I'd still be at home in bed if I were still alive at all. I asked the Lord to send me an angel, and he heard my prayers. After I had talked to a lot of the women who had been in this protocol, most of whom were not as eloquent as this, but many of whom had achieved really astonishing transformations, I decided to write an article about it for the Times, and I proposed the topic, and they seemed interested, and I turned in the article, and my editor called me and said, you understand, we really can't publish this. And I said, no. I said, why? Well, he said, it's just, it's a little bit ridiculous, this thing about all of these people and their lives were so awful, and then they became virtually sort of vice presidents at Morgan Stanley afterwards. He said, it's just, I've never heard of such a thing, it just doesn't seem real. And I said, I know you've not heard of it, and I really hadn't heard of it either, but I went out and I reported it, and the reason you haven't heard about it is that there aren't many of these treatment programs. I said, but that's actually what makes it news, and you are a news magazine. And then I went down, after I eventually got a sort of watered-down version of the article done, and I met with people in Congress to talk about the situation. And I met particularly with Pete Domenici, Republican of New Mexico, and the late Paul Wellstone, Democrat of Minnesota, who were the two people who had worked the most on mental health legislation in Congress. And I said, treatment programs for these people would be the humane thing to do. The changes in these lives are extraordinary. I said, but even if you're not very focused on those questions of what's humane, I said, This is someone who was receiving social assistance with children who were most likely headed toward the juvenile justice system, whose children are now planning meaningful careers, and who herself has a job and is a functioning member of the society. I said it is in the economic interests of the country to provide adequate treatment for people who are disadvantaged from mental health disorders. And it's extraordinary that there are so few programs and that there is so little access available. And Domenici gave me a sort of long, complicated explanation. He said, well, what you're talking about would be a healthcare directive, and this is a Congress that's resistant to directives, especially in the area of healthcare. He said there are all kinds of problems with that. He said, we have a line item budget, and even if over time this makes economic sense, we can't take the money this year out of justice programs to pay for setting up programs of active outreach into these communities. And it sort of went on and on and on. And then I met with Paul Wellstone afterwards, and he said to me, we live in a representative democracy, and in a representative democracy, all of the voters have representation on Capitol Hill. But the people you're describing aren't voters. He said on election day, they're not in the polling places, they're mostly at home with the covers pulled up over their heads. He said, and it would take a lot of political capital to bring about this kind of change. And it's not something anyone can afford to do unless they know about the situation, understand it, and develop a will to bring about some degree of change in it. So that's why I have a little feeling of mission about that piece of the story. Some people in the circumstances of the women I spent time with then will have better access to care under the reformed health legislation. Some of them still won't. I'm going to close by reading to you the last things that were said to me, or not the last things that were said to me, but things that I put last in the book that were said to me by the three people I started with, Laura, Maggie, and Frank, who had the brain surgery. I'll start with Frank. If I had it to do over, I wouldn't do it this way. But I think I've gained a lot and grown a lot because of it. I've become closer to my parents, to my brother, to friends. I have this experience with my doctor that's been very good. There really are upsides to depression. It's just hard to see them when you're in it. I said I would do it differently if I had it to do over again, and I guess I would. But now that I feel like the worst is over, I'm grateful for having been where I've been. I do believe I am better off having been to the hospital 30 times and having had brain surgery. I've met so many good people along the way. And I would just say that he's now married, that his kids are friendly with my kids. He's gone on and built a life. But I was very interested that element of resilience that I feel had kept him going in such dire circumstances also helped him to see some value in the depression. And that issue of value seems to me to be at the center of this question of depression and the creative mind. This is from Maggie, who was the person who I knew for so long and who talked about the veil of happiness being taken away. She said, I used to get nervous a lot, and I would just talk and talk. And then I started volunteering at an AIDS residence. They had teas there, and I was supposed to help get the tea and cake and juice for the patients and to sit with them and chat, because many of them didn't have people to visit them and were lonely. I remember one day early on, I sat down with some people and tried to kick off a conversation by asking them what they'd done for the 4th of July. They told me, but they just weren't keeping up their end of the conversation at all. And I thought, this is not very friendly or helpful of them. And then it hit me. These guys aren't going to make small talk. In fact, after those first brief answers, they weren't going to talk at all. But they didn't want me to leave. So I decided, I'm here with them, and I'm going to be with them. It's simply going to be an occasion where I'm a person who doesn't have AIDS and doesn't look really sick and isn't dying, but who can tolerate the fact that they do and they are. And so I just stayed with them that afternoon without talking. The loving is that you are there, simply paying attention unconditionally. If suffering is what the person is doing right then, that's what they're doing. You're being with that, not trying like crazy to do something about it. I've learned how to do that. Our needs are our greatest assets. I am able to just be there with people because of the stuff I've needed from people. I guess I've learned to give all the things I need. And this is from Laura, who wanted to chew on a leaf in the botanical garden. Depression has given me kindness and forgiveness where other people don't know enough to extend it. I am drawn toward people who might put off others with a wrong move or a misplaced barb. I had an argument about the death penalty tonight with someone, and I was trying to explain, without being too self-referential, that one can understand horrifying actions, understand the terrible links between mood and job and relationships and the rest of everything. I would never want depression to be a public or political excuse, but I think that once you have gone through it, you get a greater and more immediate understanding of the temporary absence of judgment that makes people behave so badly. You learn even, perhaps, how to tolerate the evil in the world. I'll just close by saying that those were stories that were very transformative for me, transformative in my creative process, but transformative also in my life, and that I agree with them. I don't want to be depressed again, and I don't have the option of living my life another way, so there's nothing much to be accomplished in pondering whether I would have preferred to have life go a different way. But I think there's a great deal that one can draw from the experience. I think creativity is one of the ways of manifesting whatever it is that one can draw from it. A few years after I published this book, my college roommate committed suicide, as a couple of students have here. And it was shocking at the time. He was someone who had always seemed joyful. He lived very far away, and I didn't see him very often, but I knew the people who were depressed. Maggie was depressed. Terry was full of exuberance and full of energy and full of happiness. And I had to suddenly think, here I am, supposedly a great expert on this. I had no idea. I didn't see it coming. And I think that one of the ironies, maybe the central irony that I found in working on all of this, and of course I then understood Terry's exuberance as a kind of mask over what I was able to reinterpret as evidence of great despair. But I think there are many people who feel depressed or experience depression, and what they want to do is to push it away and ignore it, and if they can pull themselves out of it enough to function, never to talk about it or think about it again, to make themselves safe from it. And there are other people who go through these experiences and plunge into them and keep thinking about them. And even though that sounds in many ways like the harder route, my experience with all of these people and with many others is that it's actually the better route. It's the attempt to keep it at bay that makes one most vulnerable to it, and the attempt to live more deeply in it and to integrate it into a coherent narrative of a life. That's the thing that makes it tolerable and that allows one to say, as I do, that every day that I wake up and don't feel like that seems like a blessing in a way that I don't know that I would have been able to imagine if I hadn't had those rather grim experiences. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'll be glad to take some questions if anyone has them. Yes? I think there's a microphone in front, or I can just repeat questions if you want to ask them. Yes?
This is a prepared question. I actually came with it. You know how when you learn a new word, very often you'll see it again the next day and maybe several times in the first work. I began to study courses of the prodromes of various diseases, and I saw a link. In your studies, did it occur to you, or did you come across any revelatory evidence that depression is caused by viruses? I'm thinking of, there are several cytomegalovirus Epstein-Barrs that have certain kind of prodromes. They have a cyclical nature, which depression also does. And during a prodrome, there are no symptoms. It's the onset, and yet they seem to be precursors of these kinds of viruses. I noticed that. Did you stumble on anything like that?
Well, it's a slightly technical question, but it's a very interesting one. There's been some really interesting research that's come out of Hungary just in the last 18 months or so, which has linked the onset of schizophrenia to early exposure to toxoplasmosis, which is carried by cats particularly. It does not mean that everyone who has a cat will have children who end up developing schizophrenia. But there is an idea that actually the presence of those viruses can have an effect on, especially on early neurological development. There's also evidence that there's a possible viral basis if a mother has certain viruses. There was an actually rather bad article in the Times a couple of weeks ago about the idea that viruses cause autism, and it was unbelievably reductive and simplistic, and there was a lot that was wrong in the scientific arguments it put forward, but in point of fact, the early exposure to uterine viruses has been associated with a variety of later life problems and seems to be connected to, schizophrenia is for various reasons easier to measure because it's less frequent and the diagnosis is usually clearer. So there's no question that early exposure to viruses actually affects neurology, and if it can affect neurology in those dramatic ways, it can doubtless lead into depression. In addition, there's the question that I think you were asking, if I understood it correctly, which is that the onset of some of these illnesses is associated with depressive type symptoms. And the one in which that's most obvious, I think, is Epstein-Barr or chronic fatigue, where people just lose all of their energy and vitality. And because they don't at that point appear to have a lot of other symptoms, it seems to be a psychiatric diagnosis. I think that viruses can exacerbate all of these things, and I think we have very little understanding of exactly how it works. I do think sometimes people get treated for depression when what they actually have is a virus that would respond better to an antiviral agent of one kind or another. And I think that sometimes people go through a lot of treatment for somatic illnesses that they don't actually have because what they really have is just depression. And if you were able properly to treat the depression, all of the constellation of symptoms around it might remit. But I think the diagnostic process is not so great, and there is a lot of overlap. Yes.
I meant to open, I feel rude, I meant to open by saying thank you so much for a brilliant talk.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Other questions? Someone in the back?
What theoretical orientation have you found most effective for you, psychotherapy-wise?
What kind of psychotherapy? So my real feeling about psychotherapy in general is that while the modality is important, the competence of the person practicing it is what's most important. And I happen to have ended up with someone who has psychoanalytic training and who's been unbelievably helpful to me. The psychoanalytic training has very much informed the therapy that we've done over many years, but I don't know that I would therefore say everyone should go psychoanalytic. I think it was a good match. There was a study done quite a long time ago now in which they took a group of people who had mental health diagnoses, relatively mild ones, and they assigned them randomly, some of them to incredibly well-known psychotherapists, and some of them to people who were sort of just English teachers, not that there's anything just about being an English teacher, but anyway, to people who didn't really have all those qualifications, and they asked them after the third session, do you think this person can help you? And the people didn't know what the qualifications were of the people they were seeing. Those who thought the person would help them were better a year later, and those who didn't weren't, no matter whether the person were well-trained or not. Having said all of that, I think cognitive behavioral therapy has been an important breakthrough. I think that it's got a lot of press, and I think that interpersonal therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy are both also very effective for large groups of people. I still think that if one has the leeway for it, that the more probing methods that have come out of psychoanalysis can be very vital, though I think classic psychoanalysis itself is not effective in the treatment of depression. That wasn't a very clear and precise, this is the one answer, but I think that's sort of the spectrum that's out there. Yes?
Again, thank you. That was a really great talk.
Thank you.
I wanted to know if you found the ritual to be helpful at all.
If I found the...
What's it called?
Oh, yes, absolutely. You know what? I did actually find it I found it very exhilarating. I mean, partly because I thought, I'm going to be telling this story, but actually, it was a very moving ceremony. It was a very moving ceremony. It had many pieces to it, and I give you a very, very quick and sort of jokey description of it. It had many pieces to it that were very compelling. The sense that the entire village were not paid for doing it. It was just a thing that they did. And that I had this problem. They were all taking the day off. They were all going to spend the whole day doing all of these things to try to help me feel better. It was very powerful. It was I felt enormously supported by it. And I don't happen to believe in the sort of underlying idea of what exactly it was that was being exercised from me. So it didn't have an effect at that level, but it was moving, and I think that the pace of it and whatnot, it was a very exhilarating thing, and I met a lot of people, both in that town and elsewhere, because I spent some time in Senegal and traveled around and talked to people about it, who were doing way much better after they had Nund up, and I saw that it had worked for many people. And I will tell you that I had also the interesting experience when I was in Dakar. I went to what was supposed to be one of the better mental hospitals in Dakar. When I went there, they were explaining their admissions procedure, and part of the admissions procedure in that hospital, and indeed in all of the hospitals that were functioning in that region, was that if someone came in, a member of his family came in with him, they lived together in the hospital. The other person who came and lived in the hospital with that person also attended whatever the sort of therapeutic interventions were. That was a medical facility, not someplace that was doing something that was ritual, and learned a lot about them. And when the person went home, that other person went home with him and helped to sustain that ethos. And I thought to myself, gee, here, your relative goes in, they're shut away, you have an hour a day maybe when you can come and visit them by and large, unless it's a small child and there are special arrangements. And then the person is released back out into the world and has to suddenly deal with the whole world and nobody knows quite how to support them. I thought there was actually a lot to be learned from the situation there. So it's a fun story, but actually it was quite a profound and revelatory experience for me. Yes?
I have two questions. I wanted to ask first, would you consider someone like, or would you say that you have, I guess, it sounded like when you were talking about how you feel when you're depressed, that you have very low amounts of dopamine in your mesolimbic pathway. And that is also a very big part of ADHD. Would you consider ADHD in that sense to be maybe a form of depression?
It's another extremely interesting question, whether ADHD is in any way a form of depression. I'll answer the question a little bit indirectly. There's been a huge amount of work recently on the genetics of both autism and schizophrenia, which have been being researched as two separate areas. And Mike Wigler, working at Cold Spring Harbor Lab, demonstrated that there are many locations on the genome which are sensitive to repetitions, where you get multiple copies of genes, or to deletions, where you get an insufficient number of copies of those genes, and that it appears that in many instances, multiple copies of a given gene result in autism, and deletions of the same gene may result in schizophrenia. The reason that I bring it up is simply that autism and schizophrenia used to be thought of as versions of one another. Autism was originally described, as childhood schizophrenia. And then we had this revelation that actually they were very different and their symptoms were very different, as indeed they are, and that they were structurally very different, and that the phenotype, the way that the genes were expressed, leads to something altogether different. But if they actually deal with repetitions and deletions in the same spot, then they're very closely tied together. And while the downstream mechanisms may be different, the originating problem may be quite similar in those two illnesses. And I was interviewing John Crystal, who's the head of the Department of Psychiatry at Yale, and I said to him, well, do you think that the distinctions between all of these illnesses are going to break down? And he said, it would not surprise me if in 20 years we think it's all on a spectrum. So do I think ADHD is the same as depression biologically? I haven't seen a lot of evidence right now that points to a very specific way of describing that. I mean, they both clearly entail in some measure or another dysregulation of neurotransmitters, but whether they're really the same neurotransmitters, whether they're the same receptors that are getting over or under stimulated, I think it's a kind of sea of confusion, And I think that the serotonin hypothesis of depression, the idea that it's an imbalance of neurotransmitters, is very socially useful because a lot of people feel better about taking medication if they say, you know, you just don't have enough serotonin in your brain. I'm not convinced that serotonin is really the causal factor even in depression. But the idea that all of these things that are dysregulating go together seems very valid, especially because people who are depressed usually have a lot of trouble focusing. So while it's not ADD, they have a lot of trouble staying focused on something over a period of time in a way that's very similar to ADD. And a lot of people who have ADD, because their experience of the world is so disrupted, have concomitant depression. So the two things are braided, I think, probably both biologically and socially, though it would be difficult to, you know, put it up on a slide and explain it that way clearly.
Thank you. And my last question is, where exactly is Area 25 in the brain?
I was sure that someone was going to ask me that. I believe it's in the anterior cingulate. I'm not quite sure, but I have known, and I'm bad on that. Sorry, but it's easily found. Well, I mean, it's easily found online rather than in your head. So, yes.
I have a question, just because your background is quite a different than a clinician's background. How would you describe the difference between, I won't say garden variety, it's not garden variety, depression versus bipolar depression, and also what are the differences in terms of relative success rates and diagnosis and
Well, traditionally, the difference between unipolar depression and bipolar depression, which is the question, is that bipolar depression involves going through periods of mania that is usually marked by psychosis, which then give way to these terrible depressions, which then lead again into these periods of manic psychosis. While unipolar depression does not entail psychosis, it entails being depressed, and sometimes you feel a little better and then you feel a little worse, but you either stay consistently a little below average, or you're kind of doing all right, and then you plunge down for a while, and then you come back up and you do all right for a while, and then you plunge down again, but without the manic piece of it. For a long time, there was a kind of mythology in the world of neurology, which is that many people had this sort of constant mild depression, and yet strangely nobody had constant mild mania. Nobody had ever come in for treatment of that, and so it was assumed that it didn't exist. I don't know if any of you have seen Bill Clinton speak, but there is such a thing as a consistent low level of mania. And it's a very productive and positive way to be, and that's why nobody has sought treatment for it. So I think there's more symmetry than there has appeared to be. I think there are many people who have what's now called bipolar 2, in which they have manic periods, but they don't have psychotic manic periods. They just have periods in which they become over-energized, don't need so much sleep, get sort of super up and zingy about things, and then come back down. But I think that the neurology or the mechanisms of bipolar illness are somewhat better understood than the mechanisms of depression. Frequently, though, I think people are misdiagnosed with one or the other, and I think that as a general statistical thing, not because I'm qualified to say which person has been misdiagnosed, but there's a lot of confusion about it. In terms of their response to treatment, bipolar disorder is harder to treat, has a higher suicide rate, and is a more devastating diagnosis than most depressions. Some people have milder bipolar, some people have worse depression, some people have a personality that can deal better or not as well. But essentially, there's a lot of variety there in the response to them. The medical course for bipolar disorder is clearer. It responds most to lithium and then to a variety of drugs that were originally developed as anticonvulsants. It's less vague and less shadowy, but it's a more serious illness and more difficult to get fully under control. So, yes?
Johns Hopkins recently has been using hallucinogenic therapy with depression associated with the terminally ill. And are you familiar with this new approach or kind of old current therapy? Is there any potential or possibility for a new broad medicine?
There's a big study on that going on right now at Bellevue, actually, as well. It's an interesting area. It will be interesting to see if they discover that some of these treatments are effective. The question was about using hallucinogenics for the treatment of depression in people who have got terminal illness. It will be interesting to see whether the results really hold up as the studies get larger for people with terminal illness, and B, how we as a society that's incredibly uncomfortable with, drugs as opposed to medications would respond to the idea of using, if there's been so much resistance to using marijuana to treat the pain of the terminally ill, the idea that suddenly you'll extract things from magic mushrooms and they'll be broadly available, strains credulity a little bit. So I think there are going to be a lot of impediments to having that research lead to real shifts in treatment, but there certainly are people who seem to have benefited from it enormously. And it's interesting to look at that question of terminal illness or extreme depression even, because I think many substances act differently in people depending on what their psychiatric condition is. So for example, my original depression entailed an unbelievably acute and relentless and constant anxiety. And the only way that I was initially able to control it was with Xanax. And I was at that point taking between 15 and 20 milligrams of Xanax a day to deal with this terrible, well, now if I take half a milligram of Xanax, I'm sort of out for 12 hours. But I had so much tension and so on, and so I needed it to kind of bring it down. I think a lot of the time the hallucinogenics that are being used in people who are terminally ill end up affecting their pain and not causing an enormous amount of hallucination. And I don't think the mechanisms of that are understood at all. But I think it's an interesting area for research, and I hope it won't be stymied by a kind of social conservatism around those particular substances. Yes. Sorry, you in the, there we are. Sorry.
Okay. So if you say that there's a link between depression and creativity, does treating depression then inhibit creativity in any way?
Oh, depression can certainly inhibit creativity. And a lot of the time, I think that what happens is that depression conduces to creativity after you stop being depressed, rather than conducing to creativity while you are depressed. So I think that's frequently the direction of it. I think there are insights that come out of depression which can lead to creativity. I think there's a kind of profound reckoning with the nature of life that's part of creativity that can in fact lead to depression. But I certainly feel like, especially if we're talking about the kind of really serious depression that affected the people whom I was describing just now, the idea that it's such a wonderful state and everyone should have one and then we could all be Picasso is misguided, and that actually if we had the capacity to address it more effectively and to save a lot of people that suffering, that would be tremendous. I'm going to take just two more and then I'll stop. Did you want to, sorry, you started and got cut off. I would say, the question is about what pre-depressive episodes I had had. I remember just having moments of feeling overwhelmed by everything. I can remember being in college and it being a Saturday. I remember one particular Saturday night incredibly vividly, and I'd been invited to a party, and I remember going to it and getting to the door and thinking, I just can't go in there. I can't go in there, I can't deal with all of these people. And they were my friends. It was not some terribly intimidating event. And it was the kind of party that I, on other occasions, would have liked to go to. I can remember stretches like that. I can remember stretches when I looked at the things I had to do and got overwhelmed. My kind of, entry-level experience with depression is frequently anxiety. I can remember suddenly not being able to sleep because I just felt like I could never do my work, I could never get it finished, and I didn't know what I was going to eat the next day, and just getting into a complete, and I don't know what socks to wear. So I just felt overwhelmed by those experiences. And they happened a number of times. And then the thing that was really the serious precursor was the summer after I graduated. I had a Eurail pass and I was going around and doing things, and I was meeting up with various friends in various places, and I just remember getting to Vienna, Dr. Freud, hello Dr. Freud, but I got to Vienna and I had become so anxious and I couldn't sleep at all, and I didn't sleep for 3 days, and I was staying in a rather unpleasant kind of youth hostel, but I never left my little room. I didn't eat, I didn't sleep, I couldn't do anything. I eventually just thought that this is really bad, and I went home. I felt like an idiot. I thought I really wanted to do this summer. I mean, I'd done much of it that summer, but I just remember, and I didn't understand that it was an illness, it was treatable, those symptoms made sense, they were part of a larger experience. I just thought, I've become crazy, something terrible has happened. I got home, I got through the rest of the summer, it was fine, but now I think to myself, oh, that was a little preview, and you could have taken action then and not had a lot more related things that happened after that. So one last one. There's someone waving his hands wildly over there. Yes?
My friend has a question.
Well, thank you for your speech, first of all.
Thank you.
And second of all, I was wondering, so you don't want to tell a depressed person everything's going to be fine, and you don't want to tell a depressed person your life sucks. What would you recommend one says to a depressed person?
People ask me all the time, the question is what one says to a depressed person, and it's actually, it's a subtle art, because what you want, in the first place, depression is a disease of loneliness, and what you want to do is to mitigate the aloneness of someone who is depressed. So frequently the depressed person will say, I really just want to be by myself, and sometimes that means you can be in the room but just don't talk to me, and sometimes it means be in the next room, and sometimes it means just come by 3 times a day, but it basically never means just really leave me alone, because when you leave people alone, they become even more isolated and their depression escalates. But the question of what tone to take, I've been doing work for completely separate reasons on attachment, on how mothers and babies relate to each other. And in doing that work, I came across this idea of reflection and containment, that what a mother is supposed to do if your baby is unhappy, if your baby is giggling and burbling, you're supposed to giggle and burble right back. And if your baby is unhappy, you're supposed to have an expression of concern in which you are responding in a specific, obvious way to the fact that your baby is unhappy, but you are not supposed to look like you're as unhappy as the baby, because that's a terrifying, nobody can help me kind of situation. And while that is a principle in attachment, it also, I think, and it took me a long time to think of it, but it really seems to me to apply to this. You have to try to understand what the other person is going through. You have to acknowledge it. You have to not trivialize it and not dismiss it and not say, it's all going to be fine in some patronizing way, but at the same time you need to contain it and to say, it's so awful, in effect. I mean, what one says to any individual obviously varies. In effect, to say, it's unbelievably awful, it's an unimaginable, terrible pain, it probably will pass over time, and I will be here with you to help you get through to the point at which it's okay. That's more or less the message in whatever way makes sense in any relationship. So, on that note, I thank you all so much for coming. Thank you. Thank you.